The Montana sun was setting as Staff Sergeant James Cooper stepped off the Greyhound bus, his army duffel bag slung over his broad shoulders. The small town of Pine Creek hadn't changed much in the 8 years he'd been away. The same old diner still sat on the corner, and the rusty water tower still loomed over Main Street like a tired guardian. Cooper took a deep breath of the clean mountain air. After 3 intense tours in Afghanistan with the Special Forces, the quiet of his hometown felt almost unsettling. His boots made a steady rhythm on the cracked sidewalk as he walked toward his Uncle Mike's auto repair shop, where he'd be working starting tomorrow. The shop's neon sign flickered in the growing darkness. Mike's Auto Repair, open since 1985. Cooper smiled, remembering how he used to help his uncle fix cars during summer breaks from school. Those memories felt like they belonged to a different person now. The war had changed him in ways that most people back home wouldn't understand. As he approached the shop, Cooper saw his uncle's familiar figure standing in the doorway. Mike Cooper was shorter than his nephew, but built just as solid, with gray hair and hands that showed years of honest work. The older man's face broke into a wide smile when he saw James. "Look who finally made it home," Mike called out, walking forward to give his nephew a firm hug. "How was the bus ride?" "Long," Cooper answered simply. He'd never been much for many words, and the military had made him even quieter. But his uncle understood. Mike had served in Vietnam, and he knew how it felt to come home carrying invisible weights. The apartment above the shop was small but clean. Mike had prepared it for Cooper's arrival, stocking the fridge with basic groceries and making sure the bed had fresh sheets. "It's not much," Mike said, "but it's yours for as long as you need it." Cooper set his bag down and looked around. The simple room already felt more like home than any of the bases he'd lived on overseas. "It's perfect, Uncle Mike, thanks." Later that night, after his uncle had gone home, Cooper sat by the window, watching the quiet street below. His mind wandered back to Afghanistan, the intense missions, the brotherhood of his team, the constant alertness that had kept them alive. A car backfired somewhere in the distance, and Cooper's body tensed automatically, his hand reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. He took slow, deep breaths, just like his therapist at the VA had taught him. The PTSD wasn't as bad as it had been right after he got back, but Cooper knew it would take time to fully adjust to civilian life. That's why he'd chosen to come back to Pine Creek instead of staying in a bigger city. Here, he could heal at his own pace. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, his younger sister who lived 2 towns over with her husband and kids. "Made it home safe, big brother? The kids can't wait to see their Uncle James." Cooper smiled as he typed back a simple yes. "Tomorrow after work?" He hadn't seen his niece and nephew in person for over 2 years, only through video calls when the military internet had worked well enough. Before going to bed, Cooper went through his evening routine, checking the locks twice, placing his keys and wallet in exact positions on the bedside table, and doing 50 push-ups. The familiar exercise helped quiet his mind. As he lay in bed, Cooper thought about tomorrow. Working as a mechanic would be different from leading Special Forces missions, but he was ready for the change. His uncle had mentioned that the shop had been having some trouble with a local motorcycle gang, but Cooper wasn't worried. After what he'd seen and done overseas, a few rowdy bikers didn't seem like much of a threat. Still, as he drifted off to sleep, Cooper's military instincts remained sharp. He'd learned the hard way that it was better to be prepared for trouble and not need it, than to need it and not be prepared. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, and James Cooper would face it the same way he'd faced everything else in his life, with quiet strength and careful planning. The night settled quietly over Pine Creek, but James Cooper's story was just beginning. The peaceful hometown he remembered was about to show him its darker side, and the skills he'd hoped to leave behind in Afghanistan would soon prove more valuable than he could have imagined. 2 weeks into his new job at Mike's Auto Repair, Cooper was beginning to understand why his uncle needed the help. The Devil's Hand motorcycle gang had been making life difficult for local businesses, and Mike's shop was no exception. Cooper watched through the garage window as 3 motorcycles roared past for the third time that morning, their engines deliberately loud enough to bother customers. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly regular customer, jumped at the noise as Cooper changed her car's oil. "Those horrible men," she said, shaking her head. "They've been getting worse since your uncle refused to pay them their so-called protection money." Cooper wiped his hands on a shop rag and gave her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry about it, Mrs. Henderson. We'll handle it." His voice was calm, but his eyes tracked the bikers as they disappeared around the corner. Later that afternoon, Uncle Mike called Cooper into his office. The small room was cluttered with invoices and old car manuals, and a fresh scratch marked the office's front window. "Courtesy of the Devil's Hand," Cooper guessed. "Found this under the door this morning," Mike said, sliding a piece of paper across his desk. The note was simple. $2,000 a month keeps your shop safe. Last warning. The paper had a crude drawing of a devil's hand giving the middle finger. Cooper studied the note carefully, his military training kicking in as he noticed details. The paper quality, the handwriting, even the way it had been folded. "Have you called the police?" Mike laughed without humor. "3 times this month. Sheriff Davies says without proof, there's nothing he can do. Besides," he lowered his voice, "word is the Devil's Hand has someone on the inside at the station." That evening, after closing time, Cooper was cleaning up when he heard glass breaking at the back of the shop. Moving silently, he made his way through the dark garage. His combat boots, which he still wore out of habit, didn't make a sound on the concrete floor. 2 figures in black leather jackets were spray painting the back wall. In the dim light, Cooper could make out the beginning of their message, "Pay up, EOR." "I wouldn't finish that if I were you," Cooper said quietly. The vandals spun around. The taller one, wearing a bandana with a skull pattern, pointed his spray can at Cooper like a weapon. "Mind your own business, grease monkey. This is between Mike and the Hand." Cooper didn't move. His stance was relaxed, but any trained fighter would recognize how he had positioned himself, ready to react in any direction. "Mike is my uncle. That makes it my business." The shorter vandal stepped forward, trying to look tough. "You don't know who you're messing with, man. The Devil's Hand owns this town." "No," Cooper replied, his voice still calm but carrying an edge that made both men pause. "You don't know who you're messing with. Leave now, and we can forget this happened." The men looked at each other, then back at Cooper. Something in his steady gaze made them hesitate. The taller one grabbed his friend's jacket. "Come on, let's go. We'll let Snake handle this tomorrow." After they left, Cooper cleaned up the broken glass and tried to wash off the partial graffiti. He took photos of everything first. Evidence might come in handy later. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister Sarah. "Still coming to Tommy's birthday party Saturday?" Cooper smiled slightly as he texted back, "Wouldn't miss it." He didn't mention the trouble at the shop. No need to worry her. But as he finished cleaning up, his mind was already working on plans and contingencies, just like he used to do before missions. That night, Cooper sat in his apartment above the shop, cleaning his legally registered handgun, another habit from his military days. He had no intention of using it, but the familiar routine helped him think. The Devil's Hand was used to intimidating ordinary civilians. They weren't prepared for someone with his background and training. But Cooper knew escalation wasn't the answer. He'd seen enough violence in Afghanistan to last a lifetime. There had to be a smart way to handle this situation. Still, as he listened to motorcycles rumbling in the distance, he couldn't help but think that tomorrow would bring trouble. And whether he wanted it or not, James Cooper was about to be pulled into a fight that would shake Pine Creek to its core. The following day brought dark clouds and trouble to Pine Creek. Cooper was working under a lifted truck when he heard the unmistakable rumble of several motorcycles pulling into the shop's parking lot. The sound was different from regular customers. These bikes had been modified to be as loud as possible. He slid out from under the truck and wiped his hands clean just as 5 members of the Devil's Hand strutted into the garage. Their leader, a tall man with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck, walked ahead of the others. Cooper recognized him from the pictures in the police reports his uncle had shown him. This was Snake, the gang's lieutenant. "Where's old man Mike?" Snake demanded, his voice echoing off the garage walls. The other customers in the waiting area grew quiet, and the young receptionist, Jenny, looked scared. Cooper stepped forward, his movements unhurried. "He's not here right now. I'm running the shop today. Can I help you?" His voice was professional, but his eyes never left Snake's hands, watching for any sudden movements. Snake grinned, showing a gold tooth. "Yeah, you can help us. Tell your uncle he's made a big mistake. No one says no to the Devil's Hand." He pulled out a smartphone and showed Cooper a video of 2 bikers following Sarah's car. "Pretty little sister you got there. Be a shame if something happened while she was driving Tommy to soccer practice. The threat to his family made Cooper's jaw tighten, but years of military training kept his anger in check. He looked around the garage, taking in every detail. 5 hostile targets, 3 civilians in the waiting area, Jenny behind the counter, tools that could become weapons if needed, and 2 exit routes. Step outside, Cooper said quietly. We can discuss this like adults. Snake laughed. Hear that, boys? The grease monkey wants to talk. His gang members spread out around the garage, knocking tools off workbenches and intimidating the customers. Cooper turned to Jenny. Take the customers out through the back and call the sheriff. His calm tone helped her keep her composure as she quickly guided the frightened people to safety. Once the civilians were clear, Cooper faced Snake again. Last chance. Leave now, and we can forget about this. Snake's response was to grab a wrench from a nearby toolbox and twirl it menacingly. You don't get it, do you? This isn't a negotiation. Either your uncle pays, or bad things start happening. And they start with you. Cooper noticed how Snake held the wrench. Wrong grip, poor balance, all show. The other gang members were trying to look tough, but their stances showed they were used to intimidating afraid people, not fighting trained opponents. You mentioned my sister, Cooper said, his voice now carrying a dangerous edge that made 2 of the gang members step back. That was a mistake. Snake didn't recognize the warning signs. The way Cooper's feet had shifted slightly, how his hands were relaxed but ready, the controlled breathing of someone who had been in far worse situations than this. What are you going to do about it, tough guy? Snake sneered, stepping closer. There's 5 of us and 1 of you. Cooper allowed himself a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. I've had worse odds in Afghanistan. This was the first time he'd mentioned his military background, but Snake was too caught up in his power play to notice the significance. The tension in the garage built as Snake raised the wrench. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky as the storm clouds gathered. Cooper remained perfectly still, but his mind was already several moves ahead, just like during combat operations. He knew exactly how this would play out. He had run similar scenarios hundreds of times in training and real combat. Boys, Snake called to his gang, teach this smartass a lesson he won't forget. As the bikers moved in, Cooper took a slow, deep breath. He hadn't wanted this fight, but the devil's hand had made 3 critical mistakes. They had threatened his family, they had brought violence into his workplace, and most importantly, they had severely underestimated who they were dealing with. The storm was about to break over Pine Creek, but inside Mike's auto repair, a different kind of storm was about to be unleashed. Snake swung the wrench in a wide arc aimed at Cooper's head. To the bikers, Cooper seemed to hardly move at all, yet somehow the wrench passed through empty air. In the same fluid motion, Cooper's left hand caught Snake's wrist while his right hand relieved the gang leader of his weapon. That's 1 mistake, Cooper said calmly, his voice carrying over the sound of rain that had begun falling outside. 2 bikers rushed him from different angles. Cooper recognized the tactic. They were used to overwhelming single targets with numbers. But Cooper had trained against multiple opponents in special forces, and these men weren't trained fighters. He stepped into the space between them, causing the bikers to crash into each other. A quick sweep of his leg sent the larger one stumbling into a tool cart. The second biker threw a wild punch that Cooper easily deflected, using the man's own momentum to guide him face first into the garage wall. That's 2. Cooper counted, his breathing still steady and controlled. Snake backed away, his confidence cracking as he watched his men go down so easily. Get him! He shouted to his remaining followers, but there was a tremor in his voice now. The third biker, a heavily tattooed man with brass knuckles, approached more cautiously than his friends. He jabbed at Cooper with his left hand, trying to set up a powerful right cross. Cooper recognized the boxing stance. This one had some training. Cooper parried the jab and stepped inside the right cross before it could develop power. His elbow struck the biker's solar plexus with precise force, driving the air from his lungs. As the man doubled over, Cooper controlled his descent to the floor with a simple wrist lock. 3, he said, scanning the garage to track the remaining threats. The 4th biker had grabbed a tire iron and was circling to Cooper's left. Rain drummed on the garage roof as lightning flashed outside, briefly illuminating the scene. In that flash, Cooper moved. He closed the distance before the biker could swing the tire iron, trapped the man's arm against his own chest, and used a basic hip throw that any first-year judo student would recognize. The biker hit the concrete floor hard enough to drop the tire iron but not hard enough to cause serious injury. Cooper had calibrated the throw perfectly, enough force to end the fight, not enough to cause lasting damage. 4. Cooper noted, turning to face Snake. Snake's tough guy facade had completely crumbled. He looked around at his fallen gang members. None were seriously hurt, but none were getting up either. Each was dealing with the aftermath of precisely applied force. One winded, one dazed, one nursing a wrist, and one groaning on the floor. "You don't understand what you've done," Snake said, backing toward the garage door. "The whole devil's hand will come for you now. Big Mike himself will." "No," Cooper interrupted, his voice cutting through Snake's threats like a knife. "You don't understand. I've spent 8 years fighting people who plant bombs in schoolyards and shoot at medical helicopters. You're just bullies who couldn't cut it in the real world." He picked up the wrench Snake had dropped and placed it carefully back in the toolbox. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to take your friends and leave. You're going to stay away from my uncle's shop, and you're going to forget you ever heard about my sister." Lightning flashed again, and Cooper took one step forward. Something in his eyes made Snake take 2 steps back. "Because if you don't," Cooper continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I'll show you what I learned in Afghanistan, and trust me, you don't want that." Snake looked at Cooper for a long moment, then at his groaning companions. Whatever he saw in that moment, perhaps the difference between playing at being dangerous and actually being dangerous, made him decide. He helped his friends up, and they limped out into the rain. Cooper watched them mount their motorcycles and ride away. He knew this wasn't over. Gangs like the Devil's Hand couldn't let such a loss of face go unanswered. But he had sent a clear message. Mike's auto repair was no longer an easy target. He grabbed a broom and began sweeping up the scattered tools, already thinking ahead to what would come next. The Devil's Hand would be back, probably with more men. But now they knew what they were dealing with, and more importantly, they were afraid. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the garage, James Cooper calmly cleaned up and waited for his uncle to return. He had won this round without causing serious injury to anyone, just as his special forces training had taught him, but he knew the real fight was just beginning. Word spread quickly through Pine Creek about what had happened at Mike's auto repair. By the next morning, the small town was buzzing with different versions of how one man had taken down 5 members of the Devil's Hand. Some stories made Cooper sound like a superhero, while others painted him as a violent troublemaker. Cooper ignored the gossip and focused on his work, but he noticed changes in how people treated him. Some customers looked at him with newfound respect, while others seemed nervous around him. Jenny, the receptionist, had brought him coffee and thanked him for protecting everyone the day before. You should have seen their faces when they came to file a complaint, Sheriff Davies said, stopping by the garage that afternoon. The older man leaned against a workbench while Cooper changed a timing belt. "Snake claimed you attacked them first, but the security camera across the street tells a different story." Cooper slid out from under the car he was working on. "Are they pressing charges?" The sheriff laughed. "They wouldn't dare. That would mean explaining why they were here in the first place. But listen, son." His face grew serious. "The Devil's Hand won't let this go. They can't. Their whole operation depends on people being afraid of them." "I know," Cooper replied, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "That's why I made some calls last night." After the sheriff left, Cooper's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Package received. Friends in position. Watching." He deleted the message immediately. During his time in Special Forces, Cooper had made connections with people who understood the importance of being prepared. That evening, Uncle Mike closed the shop early and invited Cooper to dinner at his house. As they sat in Mike's small kitchen, his uncle pushed a manila envelope across the table. "Found these in my old army files," Mike said as Cooper opened the envelope. Inside were photographs and newspaper clippings about the Devil's Hand going back 20 years. They started as a small group of troublemakers, but now they're involved in everything from drugs to weapons trafficking. The FBI has been trying to build a case against them for years. Cooper studied the documents carefully. "Why are you showing me this?" Mike sighed, looking older than his years. Because you need to understand what we're dealing with. After what happened yesterday, they'll come back harder. Big Mike, their leader, he's not like Snake. He's smart, dangerous, and he's got friends in high places. I figured as much, Cooper said, pulling out his phone and showing his uncle a series of text messages from his old military contacts. That's why I've got people watching the gang's movements. Ex-Special Forces operators who owed me favors. They're keeping tabs on Big Mike and his inner circle. Mike looked surprised, then smiled slightly. You've changed, James. The nephew I remember would have just tried to fight his way through this. Afghanistan changed me, Cooper replied quietly. I learned that the smart way isn't always the most obvious one. Later that night, as Cooper drove home, he noticed 2 motorcycles following him at a distance. They weren't Devil's Hand members. These riders were too skilled, too careful. They were professionals, probably hired muscle brought in from out of town. Cooper made a few random turns to confirm he was being followed, then pulled into the garage's parking lot. The motorcycles drove past, but he knew they'd be back. The Devil's Hand was testing his responses, studying his patterns. In his apartment above the shop, Cooper sat at his small desk and opened his laptop. Emails from his old team members filled the screen, surveillance photos of Devil's Hand members, reports on their movements, background information on their operations. His military training had taught him that information was often more valuable than firepower. A text from his sister Sarah lit up his phone. James, people are saying strange things about what happened at the shop. Are you okay? Cooper replied with a simple "I'm fine. Everything's under control." He didn't mention the surveillance, the threats, or the growing tension in town. Sarah had enough to worry about with her family. As midnight approached, Cooper heard more motorcycles rumbling in the distance. The Devil's Hand was gathering its forces, preparing for something big. But this time, James Cooper would be ready. The quiet mechanic they'd mistaken for an easy target was about to show them why you don't threaten a Special Forces veteran or his family. 3 days after the fight at the garage, the Devil's Hand made their move. The sun was setting when Cooper heard the rumble of dozens of motorcycles approaching from all directions. He had been expecting this. His surveillance contacts had warned him that Big Mike was gathering his full force. Through the garage windows, Cooper counted 20 bikes circling the building like sharks. Leading them was a massive man on a custom chopper, Big Mike himself. Unlike Snake's amateur intimidation tactics, this show of force was carefully planned and coordinated. Cooper calmly locked the front door and sent Jenny home early. As he walked back through the garage, his phone buzzed 3 times, the signal he'd arranged with his old teammates. They were in position. "Come out, soldier boy." Big Mike's voice boomed through a megaphone. "Let's talk about what you did to my men." Cooper stepped out into the parking lot, keeping his hands visible. Big Mike was even larger up close, 6.5 feet tall with arms like tree trunks. His leather vest was decorated with patches showing his rank in the gang, and a heavy gold chain hung around his neck. "Your boy Snake threatened my family," Cooper said evenly. "Where I come from, that's not something you walk away from." Big Mike dismounted his bike, followed by several of his lieutenants. The gang members spread out in a semicircle, some holding chains or brass knuckles. They thought they had Cooper surrounded. What they didn't see were the 3 shadows moving silently into position on nearby rooftops. Cooper's old Special Forces teammates, Rodriguez, Wilson, and Thompson, had arrived in town yesterday, blending in as ordinary travelers. Now they watched the scene through military-grade night vision scopes. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," Big Mike said, studying Cooper. "Most men would have paid up or left town by now. But this isn't Afghanistan, soldier. This is my territory." Cooper noticed how Big Mike's men were positioned. They were professionals, not thugs like Snake's group. This was going to be different from the previous fight. "I'm going to make this simple," Big Mike continued. "You got 2 choices. Either you and your uncle sell this place to me for a fair price, or we burn it down with you inside. And don't think about calling the cops. They know better than to interfere in Devil's Hand business." Cooper's phone vibrated once in his pocket. Rodriguez's signaled that police cars were approaching, probably gang-friendly officers coming to make sure no one interfered. "I've got a counteroffer," Cooper replied, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "My team has spent the last 3 days gathering evidence about your operation. The gun running, the drug trafficking, the bribes to local officials. If anything happens to me or my family, that evidence goes to the FBI, DEA, and every news outlet in the state. Big Mike's confident expression flickered. You're bluffing. Cooper pulled out his phone and played a recording. Big Mike's own voice discussing a weapons shipment with someone. The gang leader's face darkened with rage. That's not all, Cooper continued. Right now, you've got 3 highly trained snipers watching your every move. Former special forces, just like me. They're not here to kill anyone. We've all seen enough death in Afghanistan, but they will put a round through the engine block of every bike in this parking lot if things get ugly. As if to prove his point, a small red dot appeared on Big Mike's custom chopper, then another on his gold chain. The gang members looked around nervously, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. You think you're the first person to try threatening me? Big Mike growled, but Cooper could see the uncertainty in his eyes. I think I'm the first person who came prepared, Cooper answered. I've got enough evidence to shut down your operation permanently. Walk away now, leave my family and this town alone, and that evidence stays buried. The tension in the parking lot was thick enough to cut with a knife. Gang members looked to their leader, waiting for his decision. Big Mike stared at Cooper, measuring him up again, not as a small-town mechanic, but as the Special Forces operator he truly was. The sound of approaching police sirens broke the silence. Big Mike had to make a choice, and he had to make it fast. The next few moments would determine whether Pine Creek would see peace or violence, and everyone in that parking lot knew it. Big Mike's decision came with the roar of police sirens getting closer. He raised his hand, signaling his men to stand down, but kept his eyes fixed on Cooper. Show me what you got, Big Mike demanded. All of it. Cooper nodded to the darkness behind him. Thompson emerged from the shadows, carrying a laptop. He was shorter than Cooper but moved with the same military precision. Rodriguez and Wilson maintained their positions on the rooftops, their scopes still trained on the gang members. 3 months of surveillance, Cooper explained as Thompson set up the laptop. Every shipment, every payoff, every illegal deal. He turned the screen toward Big Mike, showing video footage of the gang's operations. My team has been watching you since before I even came to town. Big Mike's face turned pale as he watched the footage. You planned this from the start? No, Cooper replied honestly. I really did come here just to work as a mechanic, but when Snake threatened my family, I called in some favors. The men and women I served with in special forces, we look out for each other. Thompson clicked through more files, spreadsheets showing money trails, photos of illegal weapons, recordings of conversations with corrupt officials. The Devil's Hand's entire operation was laid bare on that small screen. Those police cars coming this way? Cooper continued. They're not your friendly local cops. My team contacted the state police and FBI. They're going to be here in about 2 minutes. As if to confirm his words, new sirens could be heard in the distance, different from the local police sirens. Big Mike's lieutenants started looking nervous, some already backing toward their bikes. You've got one chance, Cooper said, his voice firm but not threatening. Take your men and leave town. Now, my team will hold on to this evidence. If you or any of your people come back to Pine Creek, if you try to restart your operation anywhere in this state, if you even think about retaliating against anyone in this town, all of this goes public. Big Mike's face twisted with anger, but Cooper could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. The gang leader hadn't gotten to his position by being stupid. The Devil's Hand has been around for 20 years. Big Mike growled. You think you can just chase us out? Times change, Cooper replied. The same technology that lets you run your operation lets us track it. The same skills that kept us alive in Afghanistan let us gather intelligence. You're not dealing with scared shopkeepers anymore. Thompson closed the laptop as the first state police cars appeared at the end of the street. Rodriguez and Wilson had already disappeared from their positions, taking their sniper rifles with them. They would be gone before any officials arrived, leaving no trace of their presence. Big Mike looked at the approaching police lights, then back at Cooper. You've won this round, soldier, but you better watch your back. The Devil's Hand has a long memory. So do I, Cooper answered calmly. And I got the videos, photos, and bank records to back it up. Make the smart choice, Mike. The gang leader spat on the ground, then turned to his men. Mount up, he shouted. The bikers rushed to their motorcycles, engines roaring to life. As the Devil's Hand rode away into the darkness, the first state police car pulled into the parking lot. A tall FBI agent stepped out, nodding to Cooper. "Everything go according to plan?" the agent asked. "They took the deal," Cooper replied. "The evidence is yours if they come back." The FBI agent smiled. "Smart play, using their own tactics against them. Fear and intimidation only work until someone stands up to them." Cooper watched as police cars raced past the garage, following the gang's exit from town. Thompson had already vanished with the laptop, joining Rodriguez and Wilson at their rally point. By morning, his teammates would be gone, blending back into civilian life until they were needed again. Uncle Mike emerged from the garage office where he'd been watching everything. "You think they're really gone?" "They are," Cooper said with certainty. "Big Mike's not stupid. He knows we got him cornered. The Devil's Hand will find easier targets somewhere else." As the police lights faded into the distance, Cooper felt the tension of the past few days lifting. He had protected his family and his town without resorting to unnecessary violence. Sometimes, he reflected, the best victories were won with intelligence rather than force. The war he'd fought in Afghanistan had taught him how to fight, but it had also taught him something more valuable: how to win without fighting at all. 6 months after the Devil's Hand left Pine Creek, the town had changed in subtle but important ways. Mike's auto repair was busier than ever, with customers coming from neighboring towns to get their cars fixed. The story of how James Cooper had outsmarted the notorious biker gang had spread far and wide, though the details grew more dramatic with each retelling. Cooper was working on a customer's transmission when he heard familiar footsteps approaching. It was Rodriguez, one of his former teammates, dressed in civilian clothes and carrying a coffee cup from the local diner. "Just passing through," Rodriguez said with a grin. "Thought I'd check on our favorite mechanic." Cooper wiped his hands and embraced his old friend. "Any sign of trouble?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Nothing," Rodriguez replied. "The Devil's Hand pulled out of the whole state. Word is Big Mike retired to Florida. Guess he didn't want that evidence seeing daylight." They walked to Uncle Mike's office, where the older man was doing paperwork. The office had changed. Gone were the worried looks and unpaid bills. Business was good, and the town's other shop owners had started coming to Mike for advice about standing up to intimidation. "The FBI rolled up most of their operation last month," Rodriguez continued, accepting a cup of coffee from Mike. "Your intelligence helped them connect a lot of dots. They're calling it one of the biggest gang busts in state history." Cooper nodded, satisfied but not celebrating. He had learned in Afghanistan that victory wasn't about glory. It was about getting the job done and protecting people. Later that afternoon, Cooper drove to his sister Sarah's house for their weekly family dinner. Tommy, his nephew, ran out to meet him, wearing a toy military helmet. "Uncle James," Tommy shouted, "did you really fight 20 bad guys at once?" Cooper laughed, picking up his nephew. "No, buddy, sometimes being smart is better than being tough. Remember that." Inside, Sarah was preparing dinner while her husband Mark set the table. The fear that had once haunted their faces when the Devil's Hand was threatening the family was gone, replaced by the normal worries of everyday life. "The new Veterans Support Group is meeting tomorrow," Sarah mentioned as they ate. "They were hoping you'd stop by." After the incident with the gang, Cooper had started helping other veterans in the area adjust to civilian life. He understood their struggles, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the difficulty fitting back into normal society. His own experience had shown him that those military skills could be used for protecting and building community, not just for fighting. The next morning, Cooper arrived early at the garage to find Jenny, the receptionist, putting up a new sign. "Mike's Auto Repair and Security Consulting," it read. His uncle had decided to expand the business, offering security advice to other local businesses. Cooper's military experience and the success against the Devil's Hand had shown there was a need for professional security services in the area. Sheriff Davies called. Jenny told him as she made coffee. "He wants your help training his deputies in basic surveillance and threat assessment." Cooper thought about how much had changed. He had come to Pine Creek looking for peace and quiet, trying to escape his military past. Instead, he had found a way to use those skills to protect his community. The nightmares about Afghanistan still came sometimes, but they were less frequent now. Having a purpose helped. As he worked through the morning's repair jobs, Cooper reflected on the lessons learned. The Devil's Hand had thought they were invincible because they had more men, more weapons, and more fear on their side. But Cooper's Special Forces training had taught him that intelligence, preparation, and teamwork could overcome any odds. A group of motorcycles rumbled past the garage, ordinary riders now, just people enjoying the open road. Cooper watched them pass without tension. The town had changed, and so had he. He was no longer just a soldier trying to forget the war, nor just a mechanic trying to live quietly. He was both, and more, a protector, a teacher, a brother, an uncle, a friend. The skills he had learned in war had helped him build peace. As he turned back to his work, Cooper smiled. Sometimes the best victories weren't the ones won in battle, but the ones that prevented battles from happening at all. The small town of Pine Creek had taught him that. And James Cooper had taught Pine Creek that one person, standing up for what's right, could change everything.